Priscilla Hargrove stormed onto the dock like she owned the lake, screaming at the guests to leave before the homeowners association had them arrested. She waved her rulebook, threatened fines, and called in patrol boats to drag their kayaks away. Harlan Beckett only asked her one question: had she ever actually read the deed beneath her own marina? Her smile vanished the moment he unlocked the gate marked Beckett Private Waterfront. What she did next would not just end her 12-year reign over that community, it would put her in front of a county prosecutor. Harlan Beckett had spent nearly 2 decades working as a hydrological surveyor for a large construction firm before he finally walked away from it, tired of drafting reports for men who never once set foot on the land they were reshaping. Silverpine Lake had belonged to his family's trust for 3 generations, though for the better part of a decade, it sat forgotten its shoreline, overgrown its old resort cabins, slowly sinking into rot. When the trust finally released the property to him, Harlan spent 8 months alone rebuilding the wooden lodge, repairing the private road, and restoring the dock that stretched out over water so clear he could see the lake bed from the porch. He had the survey redone before he moved a single board because he wanted no ambiguity about what he owned. The lake bed was his. Nearly the entire shoreline was his. The private road on the western side was his, gated and marked, and none of it belonged to the homeowners association that ran the community called Silverpine Estates on the opposite shore. That community had a small marina of its own, but its rights extended only through a narrow water corridor granted decades earlier under an old use agreement, one Harlan assumed was still respected by whoever was managing it now. He had no interest in conflict. He believed the residents used their little strip of water, responsibly launching kayaks and pontoon boats within their own lane, and he had no idea that the homeowners association had been advertising the entire lake, his lake, as a private amenity belonging to the whole neighborhood. So when he finished the lodge and invited 6 old friends up for a reunion weekend, he did it without a second thought, posting 2 clear signs at the edge of his property that read Beckett Private Waterfront Access by Invitation Only. Among his guests were Mallory Finch, a land use attorney he had known since college; Everett Boone, a retired fire captain, built like a man twice his age; and Lydia Fairmont, an environmental consultant who could read a shoreline the way most people read a room. The group spent that Friday afternoon exactly the way Harlan had pictured it for months. They paddled kayaks along the western coves, fished off the dock, and ate a slow dinner outside as the sun dropped behind the tree line, nothing louder than a portable speaker playing low enough to hear the water lap against the pilings. Nobody drank to excess. Nobody wandered past the posted signs. From the far shore, though, a woman stood on her balcony with a pair of binoculars fixed on the unfamiliar cars parked along the private road, and she did not like what she saw. Priscilla Hargrove had been president of the Silverpine Estates Homeowners Association for 12 years, and in that time she had built a small, tightly held kingdom out of fines, threats, and a laminated rulebook she carried everywhere like a badge. She picked up her phone before she even considered whose land those cars were parked on, and called her private patrol team. One of the newer patrol staff hesitated, mentioning that the lodge across the water might sit outside the community's official boundary altogether. Priscilla cut him off without blinking. The house might be outside the homeowners association, she told him, but the lake belonged to all of them, and she intended to remind whoever was over there exactly who was in charge. Within 20 minutes, 2 patrol boats bearing the Silverpine Estates logo were cutting across the water toward Harlan's dock, engines loud enough that every head on the reunion turned to watch them come. Standing at the bow of the lead boat, loudspeaker raised to her mouth, Priscilla Hargrove shouted across the widening gap that everyone on that dock needed to clear the lake immediately, and that the homeowners association would not tolerate unauthorized guests on association waters. She docked without asking permission, stepping onto Harlan's private planks with 2 hired security men and a marina contractor named Roland Sutter trailing behind her. She did not ask who owned the property. She did not ask a single question before launching into a list of supposed violations that seemed to grow longer with every sentence, accusing the group of hosting an unregistered event, exceeding the guest limit using unregistered watercraft, and violating parking regulations along a road she had no authority over. When Mallory calmly asked which section of which governing document applied to this specific parcel of land, Priscilla only raised the laminated binder higher as though the plastic coating alone settled the matter. She told the guests to pack their belongings, pull their kayaks from the water, vacate the lake within 10 minutes, and hand over identification so the homeowners association could process a $500 fine per person. Everett asked her evenly whether she was a licensed law enforcement officer. Priscilla answered that a homeowners association president had every right to enforce community standards, a claim that made Mallory's eyebrows lift, but that Priscilla clearly believed with her whole chest. She turned and pointed at Harlan, accusing him of squatting in an abandoned lodge and inviting outsiders onto land that had sat empty for years. as though vacancy alone had transferred ownership to whoever noticed first. Harlan said nothing. He let her talk, watching her grow bolder with every uncontested word until she instructed Roland to start untying the guests' boats so they could be towed back to the association marina by force. Roland glanced at the sign reading private waterfront and hesitated, and Priscilla snapped at him in front of everyone that she was the president and he worked for her. Lydia warned that stepping past a posted private property line without consent could constitute trespassing, a comment that only made Priscilla laugh, since in her mind nobody could possibly own the water itself. She lifted her phone and began filming Harlan directly, announcing she intended to post the footage in the community group chat as proof that a trespasser had been caught red-handed. Then she delivered her final ultimatum, telling the group to leave the association's lake immediately or she would have every boat physically removed. Harlan finally moved. He walked to the small gate connecting the dock to the path, unlocked it, and flipped the reverse side of the sign around, so the larger lettering faced her directly, the words, "Private Lake Beckett Property," catching the last of the evening. Light. He looked at her and said plainly that she could not remove his guests from anything, because this was his private property, every square foot of it, including the water she was currently standing over. He added almost as an afterthought that she might want to sit down with her own attorney before she said another word to anyone on that dock. For a few seconds, Priscilla's face went completely, still the kind of stillness that comes right before someone decides not to believe what they just heard. Rather than step back, she pulled out her phone again and called the county sheriff's department, telling the dispatcher that a squatter was threatening a homeowners association official and attempting to seize control of a community lake. She believed, with the same total confidence that had carried her through 12 years of unchallenged authority, that the arrival of a badge would end this in her favor. She had no way of knowing that the man standing across from her had spent his entire career reading exactly the kind of documents that were about to unravel everything she had built. Sheriff Gideon Rowe arrived by patrol car along the Western Road roughly 40 minutes later, and he was not a stranger to Priscilla Hargrove or her habit of calling in disputes she expected him to resolve in her favor without asking a process. Single question first. He separated the two groups and asked each side to produce documentation, starting with Priscilla, who handed over the association's rulebook, a glossy marketing brochure describing Silver Pine Estates as home to a private community lake, and a printed list of fines she had personally signed earlier that evening. Gideon studied the pages for a long moment, before asking her plainly where the deed was, the actual legal document proving the homeowners association owned any part of the lake bed. Priscilla told him the association had never needed a separate deed because the lake had always belonged to the community, a claim she delivered with the same unwavering certainty she used on everyone. Harlan retrieved a waterproof case from inside the lodge and laid out a very different stack of paper. There was the deed to 146 acres surrounding the western and southern shoreline. A county-certified survey completed only 6 months earlier. Tax records listing him as the sole owner of record insurance documentation, covering the dock and the water itself. And a recent boundary map, showing his property line extending across nearly the entire lake. The association's marina, according to that same map, sat within a narrow corridor that had been granted under a temporary use agreement, nothing close to outright ownership. Gideon asked Priscilla directly whether she had ever seen this survey, and for the first time that night she changed her tone, insisting that even if Harlan owned the lake bed, the association still held what she called a traditional right of access built over years of use. Mallory stepped in to point out gently but firmly that a traditional pattern of use grants no authority to manage another owner's guests, seize private boats, issue fines, walk onto a posted dock, or run events beyond the boundaries of whatever corridor had actually been granted. Gideon ordered Priscilla and her security staff off Harlan's property immediately and warned Roland in no uncertain terms not to touch a single boat that did not belong to the association. Before she climbed back into her boat, Priscilla tried to preserve some shred of authority, announcing that this dispute was far from over and that the association would review its records and issue a formal response. Gideon's only reply was that she might want to review those records very carefully before she came back. That night, after the guests finally settled and the lake went quiet again, Harlan sat with Mallory and Lydia going over what they had just witnessed, and something about it did not add up for people who noticed details. Mallory pointed out that the association's marketing map conveniently erased the western boundary line altogether, as though someone had deliberately smoothed over the exact spot where Harlan's property began. Lydia, looking across at the association's marina lights, noted that the boundary buoys sat much farther out than the corridor described in Harlan's own survey, further out than any legitimate use agreement would allow. Before anyone could think too hard about what that meant, an email arrived from the Homeowners Association sent directly by Priscilla containing an invoice for $18,750 in fines and a warning that, Lake access would be blocked entirely if payment was not received within 48 hours. The invoice read like a list assembled by someone determined to find violations rather than someone documenting real ones, citing 6 unregistered guests, 3 kayaks, without association stickers, use of the dock after posted hours, unauthorized gathering, refusal to cooperate with the association, president endangerment of security personnel, and the hanging of an unapproved sign. Harlan had never joined the association and never would, since his property sat entirely outside its boundaries, which meant none of these fines carried any legal weight at all. That did not stop Priscilla from forwarding the entire list to every resident in the community, describing Harlan as an outside investor attempting to seize control of their lake for personal profit. The next morning brought a fresh string of provocations, a new chain strung across the water near the association marina. Red boundary buoys relocated well into Harlan's territory, and a sign reading Homeowners Association Residents Only nailed directly into a tree that stood on his own land. A camera appeared aimed squarely at the lodge, and a towing company arrived at the private road, claiming the guests' vehicles were parked illegally within community boundaries, a claim that collapsed the moment Harlan produced his survey and sent the driver away empty-handed. Mallory told him plainly that fighting the fines one at a time would accomplish nothing, and that the real question was why Priscilla felt so untouchably confident in the first place. Confident enough to fabricate infractions on the spot without hesitation. The group spent the rest of the weekend turning what had been a relaxed reunion into something closer to an investigation, with Mallory combing through every association document she could find, Lydia examining the shoreline construction, Everett quietly testing the stability of the expanded marina structure from a distance. Lydia was the first to find something genuinely alarming: an underwater power line running from the association's lighting system directly across Harlan's lakebed, without any permit on record anywhere. Everett noticed the floating dock itself had been extended nearly 30 meters beyond what any reasonable corridor agreement would allow. A physical expansion that had clearly happened, gradually addition by addition, until it swallowed water that was never the association's to build on. Buried in a set of public disclosure documents, Mallory found a single sentence, claiming that lake access was permanently guaranteed to every homeowner in the community, a promise that stood in direct contradiction to everything in Harlan's own paperwork, which described only a time-limited license. Harlan called the county records office that same evening and arranged to meet with a clerk named Clifford Ames. First thing the following morning, hoping to finally understand how two completely different stories about the same lake could exist at once. Across the water, Priscilla convened an emergency meeting of the association board, though she never once mentioned that the sheriff had already confirmed Harlan's ownership documents were legitimate. Instead, she told the board that a strange man was trying to turn their shared lake into his own private resort, and that the community needed to unite before he stole what belonged to everyone. When Treasurer Beverly Knox quietly asked whether the association actually owned the lake at all, Priscilla cut her off immediately, instructing the secretary to record unanimous board support for legal action against Harlan, even though no real vote had ever taken place. Beverly said nothing more in that meeting, but she had worked alongside Priscilla long enough to recognize the pattern, and she began quietly gathering records of her own, certain that something in those 12 years of paperwork would not survive real scrutiny. The following morning, Clifford Ames pulled a thick folder from the archive and slid it across the counter to Harlan, explaining that the original agreement between the previous landowner and the developers of Silver Pine Estates had granted the community a 40-meter access corridor, a cap of 20, 4 boat slips, and a strict 20-year term with no right of transfer or resale. That agreement, Clifford said, had expired exactly 12 years earlier, almost to the month that Priscilla Hargrove first took over as president of the Homeowners Association. Rather than notify residents that the license had lapsed, she had quietly revised the community's promotional map to erase the expiration date and continued collecting what she called a lake conservation fee from every household in the neighborhood without missing a single billing cycle. Mallory later estimated the association had collected at least $742,000 over those 12 years, through annual lake fees, boat registration charges, dock rental payments, fines levied against outside guests, event fees, and a shoreline maintenance charge that appeared on every resident's bill without explanation. During that same period, the marina had grown from its original 24 slips to 61, an expansion that never should have been possible under an agreement that had already expired before the first new slip was poured. Clifford dug further and found a late-filed addendum claiming the license had been permanently renewed, but the document was riddled with problems that made his stomach turn, and unnotarized signature page numbers that did not match the original filing, a county seal from a design that had been retired years before the document's supposed date, and the previous landowner's name misspelled in a way no official clerk would have allowed. The filing had been submitted by a law office that, as it turned out, had previously done work for Priscilla personally, a detail that told Harlan everything he needed to know about how deliberate this had all been. This was not a case of a well-meaning community leader misunderstanding old paperwork. Priscilla knew, or had every reason to know, that the association's rights had expired more than a decade ago, and she had continued collecting money and punishing residents based on authority she no longer legally possessed. Even so, Harlan hesitated to shut the lake down immediately, since many of those residents had bought their homes in good faith, believing lake access was a permanent feature of the community they were joining. Mallory reminded him that good faith on the residents' part did not erase liability on his, especially if someone got hurt using structures that had never been properly inspected or permitted. Lydia's assessment of the marina only reinforced that concern, listing risks that included electrical leakage into the water, shoreline erosion from improper anchoring, fuel contamination, damage to the lake's ecosystem, and the very real possibility that overloaded, illegally extended docks could collapse under enough weight. Harlan drafted a formal notice demanding that the association immediately stop collecting fees, halt any further expansion, submit to an inspection of the unpermitted structures, provide Beverly's financial records for review, and negotiate a new access agreement within 14 days. Priscilla refused to accept the notice when it arrived, and instead posted her own version of events to the community group, accusing Harlan of holding the lake hostage and demanding ransom money from residents who only wanted to use water that had always belonged to them. She cropped every page she shared, removing the section clearly stating the license had expired and leaving only the portion describing original community access, a selective edit designed to keep her narrative intact. Then she announced a rally calling it Take Back Silver Pine Lake and told residents that this coming Saturday every adult in the community would gather at the water and that no outsider would be allowed to stop them. Priscilla built her campaign carefully painting Harlan to the local newspaper as a cold, wealthy newcomer determined to strip ordinary families of a resource they had enjoyed for decades, when in truth, he had barely lived on the property for 8 months. Her press release claimed the association had used the lake for generations, that Harlan had appeared out of nowhere to threaten it, that he intended to raise access fees beyond what any family could afford, and that his guests had physically intimidated association staff during a routine inspection. The video clip she circulated conveniently began the moment Harlan said the words, "This is my private property," cutting away everything that came before it, including her own boats, storming an unposted dock, and her own staff attempting to seize private watercraft. Harlan refused to engage in any public argument online, choosing instead to prepare a complete evidence file containing the original survey, the expired agreement, tax records, photographs of the unpermitted construction, uncut footage from his dock cameras, a formal request for negotiation, and preliminary safety assessments from both Everett and Lydia. Mallory filed for a temporary restraining order, preventing the association from entering any part of Harlan's property beyond the original long-expired corridor, hoping to have it in place before the rally could turn into something worse. Priscilla answered by having Roland install additional floating barriers and quietly ordering him to shift the official boundary markers before the event, a request he found deeply uncomfortable given what he already suspected about the legal risk involved. Roland warned her that moving official survey markers could carry criminal consequences of its own, but Priscilla assured him the association would stand behind him no matter what happened. In a closed-door meeting, Beverly finally asked outright where the money for the new contractor work was coming from, since no such expense had ever appeared on any approved budget. Priscilla dismissed the question as an emergency expenditure and moved on before anyone could press further. But Beverly had already begun quietly copying everything she could access, including bank statements, contractor invoices, altered meeting minutes, payments routed to a consulting company. Priscilla personally owned and lake fee deposits that had been redirected into an account nobody on the board had ever approved. Some residents, growing uneasy about what they were hearing, reached out to Harlan directly rather than take Priscilla's word for granted, mostly worried about what losing lake access might do to their property values. Harlan never blamed them for their fear, and instead laid out exactly what he was willing to negotiate: a proper safety inspection of the marina, an end to fraudulent fee collection, repair of every illegal structure, formal recognition of his ownership, and an independent oversight board to replace Priscilla's unilateral control of the water. That measured, reasonable offer stood in stark contrast to the picture Priscilla had painted, and she could feel her support among residents beginning to soften in a way that unsettled her more than she let on. Determined to force a resolution before the restraining order could take effect, she pushed the Take Back Silver Pine Lake rally forward, refusing to delay even by a single day. The night before the event, Harlan's dock cameras caught Priscilla and Roland out on the water in the dark, quietly repositioning the boundary buoys under cover of night, exactly as she had ordered days earlier. Harlan saved every frame of the footage, but chose not to interrupt them in the moment, recognizing with a kind of grim satisfaction that Priscilla was about to hand him the clearest piece of evidence she had produced against herself. Yet, Saturday morning brought dozens of adult residents down to the association marina, most of them entirely unaware of the deeper story, believing they were simply showing up for a peaceful demonstration about a resource they had always assumed belonged to them. Priscilla stood in front of a small camera crew wearing an association-branded jacket and declared with total conviction that today they would prove once and for all that Silverpine Lake belonged to the community. She had brought patrol boats, hand-painted banners, a bullhorn, a chain meant to seal off Harlan's section of the water, hired security, and a printed document titled Community Lake Enforcement Order that carried no court seal, no judge's signature, and no legal standing whatsoever. Harlan stood on the western dock with Mallory Everett and Lydia beside him, having already notified Sheriff Gideon Rowe, though he was delayed handling another call and would not arrive for some time yet. Using a small loudspeaker, Harlan warned the crowd that the ground in front of his dock remained private property, that the association's own marina had never passed a proper safety inspection, that the underwater electrical system showed clear signs of danger, and that everyone would be safer waiting for the county to complete its review before stepping any further. Priscilla accused him of spreading fear tactics to intimidate residents into backing down, and ordered Roland to cut the boundary chain and physically drag a section of the floating dock toward Harlan's shoreline, while the crowd watched. As more people crowded onto that illegally extended section, the aging anchor system began to give way beneath their combined weight, and a large portion of the dock tilted sharply, sending several adults stumbling and grabbing for anything solid to hold on to. Everett moved instantly, ordering everyone to get low, throwing rescue lines toward the people nearest the water, steering Harlan's boat in close enough to help cutting the engine on the vessel that had been dragging the dock, and pulling one person after another back toward stable ground. Lydia cut power to the compromised electrical line before the submerged cable could be torn loose entirely, an action that likely prevented a far worse outcome than the bruises and scraped hands the incident ultimately produced. Nobody died that morning, but the chaos on the water proved beyond doubt that every warning Harlan had given was accurate, not exaggerated, and not motivated by greed as Priscilla had claimed for weeks. She still tried to shift blame onto him, insisting he must have sabotaged the anchoring system himself, but the dock cameras had captured every second of what actually happened, including her own voice, ordering Roland to keep pulling, insisting that once the dock sat over that stretch of water, Harlan would never be able to reclaim it. Gideon arrived with rescue personnel shortly after, and once he reviewed the footage, he demanded Priscilla hand over the so-called enforcement order she had waived at residence earlier that morning, a document that turned out to be nothing, more than a printed letterhead with no legal authority behind it at all. Gideon suspended all activity at the marina until a full safety inspection could be completed, and in the confusion that followed, Roland finally admitted to himself that Priscilla intended to let him absorb every consequence alone, if it came down to it. Beverly approached Mallory quietly amid the disarray and told her she had records proving this was not the first time Priscilla had falsified official documents, and handed over a small hard drive containing 12 years of the association's internal financial history. Buried in the final folder was a scanned copy of a deed claiming the original landowner had sold the entire lake outright to the homeowners association, a document neither Mallory nor Harlan had ever seen before that moment. Mallory and Beverly spent the following days combing through everything on that hard drive, uncovering a financial pattern that made it clear Priscilla had been running the association less like a community organization and more like a private enterprise built entirely around her own interests. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had passed through a consulting company. She personally owned a landscaping contract awarded to a close acquaintance without any competitive bidding. Marina work paid out without proper approval, unexplained legal fees with no accompanying invoices, and a so-called lake protection fund that seemed to exist only on paper. Altogether, the irregular transactions totaled more than $1,100,000, a figure that stunned even Beverly, who had suspected wrongdoing but never imagined the scale of it. Beverly explained that Priscilla routinely signed meeting minutes before meetings even occurred, then pressured the rest of the board into rubber stamping decisions after the fact, while quietly punishing any resident who pushed back with fines over trivial matters like paint color or driveway clutter. Roland, shaken by how close the rally had come to seriously hurting someone, agreed to cooperate fully with investigators, confirming that Priscilla had directed him to expand the marina, without permits relocate boundary buoys on more than one occasion, dump dredged material into deeper water, install unpermitted electrical lines, misrepresent constraint eravenovai etorexixes, and arradies and A formal hearing was scheduled at the county office, and Priscilla arrived with her own attorney, still insisting without a hint of doubt in her voice that the homeowners association held rightful ownership over the lake. Harlan laid out his case, methodically moving through his current deed, the county certified survey, the expired use agreement footage of Priscilla trespassing on his dock, footage of the nighttime buoy relocation, footage of her ordering dock dragged across the water, the safety report documenting the danger, and the financial records showing years of fraudulent fee collection. Priscilla's attorney responded by presenting what he called an ironclad rebuttal, a deed of transfer from the original landowner, complete with a signature, a notary seal, and what appeared to be an authentic county registration stamp. For a long moment, the room went quiet, since this was by far the strongest piece of evidence Priscilla had produced throughout the entire dispute, and even Harlan felt a flicker of uncertainty as he studied it from across the table. Clifford Ames leaned forward, examined the registration number printed at the bottom of the page, and asked to see the original filing before anyone moved forward, explaining calmly that something about that number did not match what he remembered from the archive. He said there appeared to be a serious problem since that particular registration number actually belonged to an entirely different transaction, one involving the sale of a storage warehouse in a completely different part of the county. For the first time since the confrontation on the dock weeks earlier, Priscilla Hargrove had no immediate answer. Clifford returned to the archive that same afternoon and confirmed what he suspected, that the registration number on Priscilla's deed had been lifted wholesale from an unrelated filing and pasted onto a fabricated document designed to look authentic at a glance. The forgery unraveled quickly once anyone looked closely, since the county seal design used on the page had not even existed on the date the document claimed to have been filed, and the notary listed as having witnessed the signature had left the profession 2 full years before that same date. The font used to describe the property boundaries did not match the rest of the page. The parcel numbers referenced a survey map created 6 years after the document's supposed creation, and the landowner's signature appeared to have been lifted directly from an entirely separate publicly available filing. No original version of the deed had ever been submitted to the county, and a digital trace on the file led investigators straight back to an upload from the association's own office computer. Beverly produced an email in which Priscilla had instructed a staff member to, in her words, reconstruct a lost document in order to protect the community's interests, language that left little room for interpretation, once investigators read it alongside everything else. Roland confirmed under questioning that Priscilla had told him more than once that as long as a document looked official enough, nobody would ever bother questioning it, a philosophy that had apparently guided her leadership for over a decade. The county prosecutor's office opened a formal investigation covering forgery of real estate documents, financial fraud, trespassing, obstruction of a legal boundary, determination, misappropriation of community fees, submission of falsified records to a government office, and endangerment stemming from the incident at the marina. Priscilla attempted to shift responsibility onto a former attorney and several board members who she claimed had acted without her knowledge. But the digital trail, the emails, and the electronic signatures all pointed directly back to Eck, accounts registered in her own name. Harlan made a point of telling investigators he had no interest in punishing ordinary residents who had simply believed what their community leader told them, since they too had been deceived, just as thoroughly as he had almost been by that forged deed. The county's rulings arrived over the following weeks, recognizing Harlan's full and unquestionable ownership of the lake, barring the homeowners association from ever again claiming authority over the water, ordering the illegal marina expansion shut down, mandating reimbursement of years of precedent, improperly collected fees, freezing several association accounts, and requiring an independent audit of 12 full years of financial records. The county also permanently barred Priscilla from representing the association in any capacity while the investigation continued, and ordered every buoy and sign she had placed on Harlan's property removed without delay. When investigators arrived to collect her phone and remaining records, she still insisted almost reflexively that everything she had done was meant to protect the community she had led for so long. Sheriff Gideon Rowe's response to that claim was simple and direct, telling her that protecting a community never gave anyone the right to forge ownership over property that belonged to someone else. In one of the investigation's quieter but more striking moments, Priscilla was escorted past the very dock where she had once ordered Harlan's guests remove the sign reading Beckett Private Waterfront, still standing exactly where it always had. Harlan did not gloat as she passed. He only repeated calmly the same sentence he had told her from the very beginning, that she had heard him the first time this was his private property. With Priscilla removed from power, the future of the lake still hung in an uncertain place, since dozens of residents who had done nothing wrong now faced the possibility of losing access entirely because of decisions made without their knowledge. Whatever came next for the community would depend entirely on what Harlan chose to do with the authority the county had just confirmed belonged to him alone. In the weeks that followed, the Homeowners Association Board convened an open meeting for the first time in longer than most residents could remember, with Beverly stepping in temporarily to help oversee the financial audit while making clear she had no interest in holding permanent power herself. Many residents approached Harlan directly to apologize for believing the version of events Priscilla had spent so long constructing, several admitting they had never once seen a document proving the association actually owned the lake, only her word and the confidence with which she delivered it. Harlan proposed a new access agreement rather than simply cutting the entire community off, believing that punishing an entire neighborhood for one leader's deception would only compound the harm already done. Under the new terms, Harlan's ownership of the lake would be formally and permanently recognized. Residents would retain access to a defined water corridor under a proper time-limited license. No one would ever again be permitted to advertise or resell rights to the lake itself. The marina would be reduced back to a safe and legal footprint. Any future construction would require his written approval. All fees would be publicly audited going forward. No individual would hold unilateral power to fine guests on the water. Harlan retained the right to close the lake during environmental or weather emergencies, and a newly formed independent committee, not a single president, would oversee daily operations. He asked for nothing close to the enormous payments Priscilla had once threatened residents with, requesting only enough to cover insurance, basic maintenance, and the ongoing protection of the water itself. Lydia oversaw the removal of the dangerous underwater electrical line. Everett consulted on a properly engineered anchoring system for what remained of the marina, and Roland, having lost his contract but avoided the harshest consequences by cooperating, fully helped repair some of the damage his earlier work had caused. The completed audit confirmed that Priscilla had diverted well over $1 million from the association over the course of 12 years, and what remained of her personal assets was frozen to begin repaying the community fund and covering the damages tied to the marina collapse. Every fabricated sign around the lake came down one by one, replaced eventually by a single honest marker near the eastern marina reading Silverpine Lake Privately Owned Community Access by License. A few weeks after the ruling, Harlan invited the same friends back for the reunion that had been interrupted so completely on that first evening, and this time Mallory arrived carrying a signed copy of the finalized agreement instead of legal filings meant for a fight. Lydia confirmed the water quality remained excellent. Everett inspected the dock thoroughly before anyone stepped onto it, and for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, there were no patrol boats circling the water. No bullhorns, no laminated binders full of invented fines. The group ate dinner in the same spot where the entire conflict had first ignited the evening quiet, except for the gentle sound of water against the pilings and the occasional distant laugh carrying across from the eastern shore. Looking out toward Silverpine Estates, Harlan watched residents using their properly licensed section of the lake exactly as intended, nobody being chased off, nobody pretending to own something that was never theirs. He had come to understand over the course of everything that happened that Priscilla Hargrove had never built her authority on any legitimate legal foundation at all. She built it instead on confidence, on fear, and on the simple fact that for 12 years nobody had bothered to check the paperwork behind her claims. All she ever needed was a loud enough voice, and for just long enough everyone around her had mistaken volume for truth. Ownership, Harlan had come to believe, was never decided by a title someone gave themselves, by a uniform, by a rule book, printed and laminated in someone's own home office, by however many years a person had gotten away with claiming something that was never theirs, by threats delivered through a bullhorn or by a glossy brochure map, with the inconvenient boundaries quietly erased. It was decided in the end by the truth sitting in county records, by documents that could withstand scrutiny, and by evidence that held up no matter how many times someone tried to talk over it. As the sun dropped behind the tree line and painted the surface of Silverpine Lake in long streaks of orange and gold, Harlan latched the small gate at the end of his dock behind the last of his guests, making their way back toward the lodge. He paused for a moment beside the sign that had once stopped Priscilla Hargrove cold in the middle of her own ultimatum, the words still catching the fading light exactly as they had that first night, "This is private property." Then he turned back toward his friends waiting near the lodge, the lake behind him finally calm and entirely his own, and said that this time nobody would ever be chasing his guests off that water again.